For more than 4 decades, one night has followed Robert Wagner like a shadow that never fades. November 29, 1981. Cold water. A dark sea. And Natalie Wood, one of Hollywood's brightest stars, gone before the sun came up. At 95, Wagner does not claim to rewrite history. Instead, he speaks about memory, guilt, love, and the silence that grows heavier with time. That night aboard the yacht Splendor of the Seas has been told and retold, each version adding questions instead of answers. Natalie had everything: fame, respect, a comeback career, and a family she loved deeply. Yet by morning, she was found floating in the Pacific near Catalina Island. The official ruling would change more than once, feeding suspicion and rumor. Wagner admits this is the hardest story of his life to speak about. Not because of headlines, but because of what was lost. Natalie was not just a movie star. She was his wife, his great love, and the person who understood his fears better than anyone else. He remembers laughter earlier that evening, small arguments that seemed unimportant at the time, and the normal messiness of marriage. As Wagner looks back now, age has stripped away defensiveness. What remains is grief. He explains that truth is not always one shocking sentence. Sometimes it is a slow, painful acceptance of how fragile life can be. This chapter is not about accusations. It is about setting the emotional ground for what follows, a story shaped by regret, memory, and the heavy weight of surviving someone the world refuses to forget. Before tragedy froze Natalie Wood in time, she lived a life filled with both magic and fear. Wagner wants people to remember who she really was, not just the woman defined by her final moments. Natalie was a child star who grew up under relentless pressure, learning early that perfection was expected and weakness was dangerous. She carried a deep fear of water, something Wagner says never left her, even as she learned to swim later in life. This fear has often been used to build theories, but Wagner frames it differently. To him, it was one of many vulnerabilities that made Natalie human. She could be brave on screen and anxious in private, confident in public, and fragile at home. By the early 1980s, Natalie was enjoying a career revival. She was excited about new roles and proud of balancing work with motherhood. Wagner recalls her laughter, her sharp intelligence, and her frustration with Hollywood's changing rules. She was no longer the ingenue. She was a woman who knew her worth. Their marriage, like many, had layers. Love, jealousy, passion, and arguments all lived side by side. Wagner does not pretend it was perfect, but he insists it was real and deeply bonded. This chapter reminds us that Natalie Wood was more than a mystery. She was a living, breathing person whose life cannot be reduced to a single night at sea. The weekend aboard the yacht was meant to be relaxing. Wagner, Natalie, actor Christopher Walken, and the boat's captain gathered to enjoy time away from Hollywood noise. But even quiet weekends can carry emotional undercurrents. Wagner admits there was tension that night, fueled by alcohol, stress, and unresolved feelings. Stories of an argument between Wagner and Natalie have become central to public speculation. Wagner does not deny raised voices. He explains that disagreements were not unusual in their marriage, especially when emotions ran high. What he pushes back against is the idea that one argument defines an entire night or a tragic outcome. Christopher Walken has often been placed at the center of theories, but Wagner describes the atmosphere as uncomfortable rather than explosive. Words were said, feelings were hurt, but nothing in Wagner's memory suggested disaster. When the night grew late, people went to their separate spaces, believing the storm had passed. Wagner says memory is a strange thing. Over time, it can sharpen or blur details. He remembers going to bed believing Natalie was safe. That belief, he says, is what haunts him the most. Not knowing exactly when things changed is harder than any accusation. This chapter explores the human reality behind the setting, a confined space, emotional people, and moments that felt ordinary until they became historic. Wagner recalls waking up to confusion, not clarity. Natalie was missing. Panic replaced sleep. Calls were made. Lights searched the water. The silence of the ocean became unbearable. In those moments, Wagner says, time lost meaning. He describes shouting her name, convinced she would answer. The idea that she could be gone forever did not register at first. It felt impossible. Natalie was afraid of the water. She would not simply wander off. This belief clashed violently with reality. When Natalie's body was discovered, Wagner says shock took over. He remembers authorities, questions, and the beginning of a process that would never truly end. From that moment on, the story was no longer just theirs. It belonged to investigators, journalists, and eventually the public. Wagner emphasizes that tragedy often creates a hunger for certainty. People want clear villains and simple explanations, but real life rarely offers that. This chapter does not provide a neat answer. Instead, it shows the emotional chaos of realizing that someone you love is gone, and that the world will demand explanations you may never fully have. In the years following Natalie's death, official conclusions shifted. What was first called an accident later became something less certain. Wagner explains how each change reopened wounds he was trying to survive. He describes cooperating with authorities and answering the same questions repeatedly. Each interview forced him back into the worst night of his life. Wagner says he understands why investigators revisited the case. Natalie Wood was a star. Her death mattered to millions. But with every new headline came renewed suspicion. Wagner found himself living under a cloud, judged by people who only knew fragments of the story. This chapter explores how public cases evolve over time, shaped not just by evidence but by culture, media, and collective imagination. Wagner does not claim investigations were unfair. He claims they were painful. The truth, he suggests, became buried under speculation. And once a narrative forms, it is almost impossible to change. For Wagner, the years after Natalie's death were not just about grief. They were about survival. Suspicion followed him into every room. Even silence was seen as guilt by some. He speaks openly about how this affected his career, friendships, and mental health. Hollywood, he says, can be forgiving and ruthless at the same time. Some stood by him, others quietly disappeared. This chapter focuses on what it means to live when your name is forever linked to tragedy. Wagner insists that no amount of explanation can satisfy everyone. At some point, he had to choose between defending himself endlessly or finding a way to keep living. At 95, Wagner speaks carefully about regret. Not because he hides something, but because regret does not equal guilt. He regrets arguments. He regrets not checking sooner. He regrets assuming everything was fine. He explains that loving someone does not protect you from losing them. This chapter explores how people often confuse regret with responsibility. Wagner draws a line between the two, not to escape blame, but to explain emotional truth. So what is the truth? Wagner reveals. It is not a shocking twist. It is a human one. He says he does not fully know how Natalie ended up in the water, and that uncertainty is his lifelong burden. He insists there was no intention, no plan, no violence, only a tragic sequence of moments that can never be replayed. This chapter reframes truth as acceptance rather than revelation. Wagner wants Natalie remembered for her work, not her death. He talks about her films, her influence, and the way audiences still connect with her decades later. This chapter shifts focus from tragedy to legacy, reminding viewers why Natalie Wood mattered long before that final night. At 95, Wagner reflects on time. Memory softens some edges and sharpens others. He admits he will carry questions to his grave. But he also speaks about forgiveness, especially forgiving himself enough to find peace. This chapter is about aging, reflection, and learning to live with unanswered questions. In the end, Wagner's truth is simple and painful. Natalie Wood's death was a tragedy, not a mystery designed for entertainment. It was the loss of a wife, a mother, and an artist. He does not ask for absolution. He asks for understanding. The truth, he says, is that some stories never end cleanly. They fade, leaving behind love, grief, and a silence that speaks louder than any rumor. And that is the truth he carries at 95.